Hey everybody, welcome to a long overdue office hours. Finally back from my road trip. Had a pretty good time, visited a few different conferences, worked my way back slowly, unconstructively through the Outer Banks, which was a nice drive, hadn't done before. And so now have made it back home where it is colder than expected, but better than the places I have recently been. Road trip included first stop was All Things Open. That was in Raleigh, North Carolina. Then headed to djangocon for the last day there. I was in Durham, so not far away, and then up to Baltimore for FOSS4G North America, all about geospatial and free software and all that good stuff. So that was, it was a nice trip. Finally home, trying to get caught up on things, and it's very interesting to go to those kinds of conferences where you have pretty good Postgres representation in a sense, as far as like user base and are people using Postgres and that kind of a thing. It's pretty good there. It's not like PGConf New York City, right? I spoke at that, I don't know, what was that now, about a month ago. And I spoke there on Postgres. But that's the diehard sort of Postgres. It's contributors, it's people who are deeply invested in Postgres ecosystem, career like DBAs and those types of folks, developers who are big on Postgres. So that's really like a hardcore, more type of crowd. When you get to something like All Things Open, what's really nice is that's it's over 4,000 people this year, so it's definitely growing back. Todd and the crew run a really great show, but it brings in so many different parts of the open source ecosystem. So really do like that conference. One of the things that happened there were a number of people I got to meet this year that I have not met previously. I've spoken to online, and I don't know where else that would have happened necessarily. So a great example. Peter from FerretDB, is the sort of MongoDB replacement built on top of Postgres. A couple of years ago, there was a discussion I had with Peter Zaitsev, and this was when I was first kind of getting my feet wet at Instacluster, when that particular acquisition had just happened, transitioning from Creditive into Instacluster. And we talked about this idea of like, hey, if you as a service provider could have access to something that was like a MongoDB replacement that's built on Postgres, is that something that you folks would be interested in? And the reality was Instacluster wasn't ready, nor was FerretDB, to kind of make any real commitment about that. But a few weeks ago, there was an article from Paul Brebner, who I knew from Instacluster. I met working there. We worked at the same time. He still works there, about how to actually hook up FerretDB with Instacluster services and just sort of playing around with that. So it was really nice to see that article come out, because I kind of, got put on the back burner with things as they unfolded. But at All Things Open, I actually happened to meet both of them. So I met Peter there from MongoDB, or from FerretDB, and I met Paul from Instacluster. And again, both people I've talked with a little bit online here and there. Had the occasional Zoom call, that kind of a thing, but have never gotten to meet in person. So that was really nice. And there's other people like that. And if you're old like me, you may remember the days of OSCON, where it was kind of this big tent open source conference, and you brought together a whole bunch of people, again, that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise cross paths with. And a lot of that was just geographically, people are dispersed, and so you need a large enough event to pull some of those people in, right, and to touch on enough different topics that you'll get some of those folks in. So All Things Open does that, and does it very well. And I think certainly if you're on the East Coast, like, it's probably the way forward, going forward. So had a good time there. At the other two conferences, like, again, like djangocon and FOSS4G both, right? Django is not necessarily about Postgres, but most Django users, or certainly a good chunk of them, are Postgres users under the hood. Same thing, FOSS4G, about geospatial and open source. One of the biggest projects within that is PostGIS. So, you can see sort of the connections to the Postgres community within those conferences. So that's why I like to kind of get out to those. And again, you get to meet new people at some of these, and meet old friends as well. And, just, again, generally it was a good time to go out and see everybody, and got to meet people. I did want to sort of talk about a few things. There are some questions that came up pretty commonly across all three. And also questions that I thought though I would start questions that are not really asked so much anymore. And it used to be if you were to go to some of these types of conferences, you would certainly get more of these types of questions. 5 years ago, you would see these, and 10 years ago, absolutely. And they seem to have gotten, the crowds as they were, have gotten away from that. And so like the first one that we just really don't see people asking anymore. It's a good thing in my opinion. Is this whole Postgres versus MySQL thing. It's not really the hot topic anymore. I wouldn't say you could say people have chosen their sides and moved on. I don't really think that's it. I think there has been probably enough of a shift where people understand the value of Postgres, and I would say Postgres is the underdog in that particular category just based on deployments. In certain communities, I think like the PHP one, it's still pretty focused on MySQL, but most other communities, Postgres is at least on equal footing, or is pulled ahead if you want to call it that. To the point where at least like people are like, okay, we see there's two different systems. Neither side really needs to validate itself, and so that compare and contrast, or just even like what is the difference? Like we don't understand why are there two things. Those questions seem to have really gone away, and that used to be certainly 10 years ago. That was some of the most common questions. You just everyone who was going to volunteer at a community booth or even in I think a Postgres commercial booth, like you would give them a primer on like here's what to say when people ask that, right? Because there may be an angle they're coming from or whatnot, so you just want to be ready because you're going to get asked. I think the other one that's kind of similar as that is sort of this Postgres versus NoSQL. uh, I think the shine has kind of come off of that, and there's different angles to that. So depending on where you're coming from, a number of the more popular NoSQL databases have kind of switched to not being open source anymore, so that's kind of awkward. But something that maybe would come up in that kind of a conversation. Um, the other thing I would say, there are people just about the language or trade-offs or whatnot. It was it was a bigger question of like, hey, what do you think about Postgres in the world of NoSQL? And now, that's not really a question that people ask. I think people understand that you can use Postgres in some of these NoSQL use cases. Also, I mean, to be frank, like the Postgres replication story has gotten better. So if one of the reasons you were looking at those was either for sharding, now you have something like Citus, or you have something like PG Edge if you were thinking like I need a distributed system. So Postgres has gotten a lot better around the ways it can be deployed and used for purposes, as opposed to like sort of a single big database, which is still the dominant way that people use it for sure. But if you thought like I have to go NoSQL to get some of these other deployment models, well, you don't have to. So um, I think the third thing, just this could be part of it, is the nature of these conferences. They tend to attract either non-Postgres users or new people in the industry. I think the deeper technical questions that we used to get more often have gone away. Probably this is also because of things like Slack that are out there for the community. So, if you have a deep technical question with Postgres, if you were to go back 20 years ago where like OSCON's the only game in town, we don't even really have Postgres conferences, like you would see people at conferences. That was like one of the few ways, you could go to the mailing list because Postgres kind of always had the mailing list. But outside of that, I think people struggled with finding ways to sort of meet up and communicate and ask questions and whatnot that didn't want to get on the mailing list. And now there's just more options in that regard. So, and certainly more companies putting out Postgres content, explaining things and whatnot. So I noticed there were a lot fewer kind of deeper technical questions that you might have otherwise seen in years past. So um, again, that could partially be due to the nature of the crowds that these particular conferences got. But I think that's generally true even at the Postgres conferences. It's not quite as much as it used to be. So you might ask, like, well, okay, so what are people asking? Like, what are the big questions that people want to know? By and large, the number one thing that we were asked at all three conferences really is essentially like, hey, is there a local meetup for Postgres? It seems, I don't feel like meetups are back, but like I think there is certainly demand for meetups to come back. And of course, the hard part is it's sort of one of two things. One is always like finding the organizer that's local to the area who wants to put in the time to put those things together. And it's not like a full time job, but it's certainly like it is effort, and you have to do it on a schedule and whatnot. So, um, that I think is the trickiest part. Some of these have come back pretty good. The San Francisco one, I think, is probably the best one out there from like we've either survived coming through the pandemic. That's really where the issue was, right? Most meetups shut down during the pandemic, and so San Francisco, I think, went online only as a result of that during the pandemic. I think now they do a mix of in person and online. So we pointed a number of people to that one. If you're in an area where there isn't one, ideally I would say go look on Meetup, maybe try to start one. Certainly join one if there's one there, because it means we used to have presence and could get one again for sure. And if you're interested in joining one, I was working with US Postgres, and they will help fund certainly ones within the United States. There's a couple of places to look in case you're wondering. You can go to meetup.com/pro/PostgreSQL. Shows a list of a bunch of different meetups that are coordinated through meetup.com. If you don't want to use Meetup for whatever reason, you can go to postgresql.org/community/user groups. I believe is the right URL for that, and that will show you user groups sort of on a more global scale. Meetup, I would say, is more US centric. But I think there's ones from both in both locations. So, you can go check either or both if you're interested, certainly if you're interested in starting one. And the Postgres community is happy to help. We send swag and help coordinate speakers and whatnot for folks that want to do that. So, but if you're in a remote place where there really isn't a local option, I would check out the San Francisco one because I know they're doing regular videos. And there's a few other ones. I feel like Ohio one is doing pretty regular videos. But that's another avenue to go to. So we're seeing the demand. I think the other thing that's a little bit of a blocker at the moment, companies, we're still in kind of this economic state where companies are not being like super spendy with travel and whatnot. So, having someone who wants to go back and forth or whatever, we're sending speakers around and whatnot, might be a little bit trickier than it otherwise would have been. And same thing for folks who want to do organizing, could be a little bit more difficult for that reason. So, but we're like I said, number one question by far, not even close, was the number one question that we were getting was like, hey, is there a local meetup? Can I join one? Like, how does that work? And that kind of thing. So, I think the demand is certainly it's back to a pretty good degree. The other thing that we got asked a lot, and this one I think definitely for sure is a little bit of, we are a United States Postgres Association booth. That's who I was working with for these shows. And, their main questions are like, so like, what are you? And certainly in contrast to something like Neon or Crunchy or like EDB, which were companies that had booths at some of these conferences. And so people see like, hey, there's a commercial thing over here that's talking about Postgres. And then we come around the corner and we see like there's a Postgres thing over here with people with, Postgres hats and jackets and whatnot. So just sort of what is that? We don't quite understand it. And I think, part of this sort of stems with in open source business for sure. We often conflate the concept of users and customers, right? And that conflation is kind of so ingrained that I think even people they look at the tools they're working with as products of their vendors. Like that's how we're used to sort of consuming our tools, and we are used to thinking about open source projects. And for example, like, I mean, if your main exposure to Postgres was Heroku, right, and you have been developing for the last decade and you've used Postgres and Heroku and all that, and then Heroku says, hey, we're changing our model, like you can still absolutely get Postgres, so maybe this doesn't affect you, but if you were doing it on like hobby sites and whatever, like you've got to look elsewhere. And then you're like, oh, so Postgres is a thing that lives outside of Heroku, right? And you've sort of got to become familiar with what does that ecosystem look like and how does that work? And so to me, like that's the goal of US Postgres is like, hey, there's a bigger community out here. It's a pretty good shot you won't stay at your company forever, even if you think you might. Acquisitions happen, and sometimes you choose a different path. So those kind of things happen. but understand that the skills that you are getting working with Postgres can play elsewhere, but also be aware that they will not play exactly the same, right? Like the ecosystem that you have working, if it's like with Django and you go to like learn Ruby or something, right? Like, so you would understand like, hey, it's a sea change in the skills I'm going to learn. Like programming is programming in some sense, but like how you program those languages is kind of different in some ways. And there's an aspect of that it's not quite as true. If like all you ever knew in the world was like Postgres, the way the EDB tells you Postgres is, then like when you go to something else, you'll be, there's an adjustment period that you have to understand. And certainly that's true. Like if you are used to Postgres in the cloud and you go to hardware, there's an adjustment period and vice versa. So we kind of talk to that and again, just sort of let people know like, hey, there's community out here and resources and look around because the Postgres world is much bigger than any particular vendor. And it's good to just be aware of that, even if you don't need to fully utilize it yet, just be aware of it. I would say it's worth people to engage within the community outside of any given vendor, for sort of career purposes and whatnot, and certainly for help and mentoring and that kind of thing is also good. So I think those are the two biggest things. Other questions, they kind of span the gamut. At PGConf New York, there was a lot of talk about extensions and some more quieter talk about money with a lot of new Postgres companies and new databases being built on Postgres and how that's played out over the last few years. That really wasn't the hot topics. AI was probably the most, talked about at PGConf New York and at these conferences. Like, hey, we've heard about Postgres for AI. Like, we think, what should we think or whatnot. And so I talked with a lot of folks about that and different ways they might want to think about AI tooling and how it comes with Postgres. And, might actually do a talk on that at some point. I think could be useful for folks trying to navigate those waters. How much of that is just like AI is kind of a dominant theme in a lot of discussions these days? That's true. Is there anything more to it? Well, I mean, Postgres is a hotbed of AI activity with some of the extensions and indexing support that it already had, right? So it's not exactly playing catch up. It's actually kind of a leader in that space if you know what you're looking for. So those are kind of the rundown of most of the questions and whatnot. We did give out a bunch of stickers, which is always good. People seem Postgres very happy using it, working with it, want to use it more. It's in a very good place from a sort of a mindshare community standpoint. And so that's all, great to hear and love to get that feedback and, always pass along thank yous to the sort of developers and whatnot, hackers working on the core system, as well as other things. So that's, I think, about going to wrap it up for the roundup of the road trip. I still have a couple more activities before the end of the year. The next one being I will be speaking at Past Data Summit, which is, I think it's November 14th through the 18th up in Seattle. You still could get tickets to go see that. Like, it's a pretty large conference focused on data and like sort of DBAs and the whole thing, not just Postgres. And it comes from the SQL Server community, but there's a Postgres piece of it this year. I will be reprising my talk on Think Like a Postgres, kind of going into the heart of the community, most likely to know that content from the SQL Server world. And so we'll be doing the Postgres version there. I don't know if they're actually going to record these videos. I think that they are, but I will try to find out and let folks know and see if I can get a sort of updated and maybe a little bit cleaner version of it. They did not record them at New York, so I do have a sort of a first run that I did. I don't know when that was, like earlier this year, I guess, of the talk on my YouTube channel, but it'd be nice to get sort of a nicer version of that up and running. So if not, I probably just re-record it. I do want to re-record the last couple pieces of that, the sort of extended version of that talk anyways. So we'll see, but that's in about 2 weeks, I guess, from now, and I'll be up in Seattle doing that talk. So until then, hope you are doing okay. World's been a bit of a crazy place. But I will see you in the next one.